Thank you for inviting me here today to participate in your program on cancer. I'm excited to talk about cancer, diet, and nutrition, and looking at some of the myths and what is fiction and what is reality. So for today, I'm going to cover a few topics, and I always warn people that I touch on a lot of topics in a little bit of detail, but I don't have time to go into any one topic in great detail. So I will share some broad information about some of the common cancer nutrition myths that you might encounter when you work with patients who are dealing with cancer. And at the end, we'll have a question and answer. So if I haven't touched on something particular in a particular topic area, you can ask me that question and I will be happy to answer it. So I want to spend a couple of minutes in the beginning talking about how we help patients understand nutrition research, because I think that's the foundation of helping them understand what's real and what is not real. I'm going to talk about 4 common cancer nutrition myths, and I'm going to talk about how we can work with our patients with kindness and sensitivity, because a lot of work that we do in the nutrition arena is around communication. So I often think that we don't put enough effort into how we are communicating. We spend a lot of time on what we're communicating. And if anything has come through in the current coronavirus pandemic, it is that if we aren't careful with how we communicate information, then people get the wrong information. So it's important for us to touch on that a little bit at the end, just to make sure that we figure out ways that we can bridge the gap. Sometimes we have a gap between what we know and what we can communicate to the patient. So I think that's a very important thing to close with. So putting the headlines into context, patients are just like anybody else in that they use social media, they surf the web, they read the newspapers, they watch the news, they get information from family and friends. There's so much information out there that it's hard for a patient to hear or see any one topic about nutrition and cancer, because it's such a broad area, and understand how that might fit into the bigger area of the whole connection between what we eat and our risk for cancer, and perhaps what we eat and what we can do to help ourselves after we're diagnosed with cancer. So putting nutrition research into context, I think, is a really helpful thing we can share with our patients. And I like to give a visual that I even have shared this with patients, but also with other clinicians, because my background is nutrition and epidemiology. And I think the epidemiology piece is important because it's that context of no one study is what is going to tell us the full picture of what we need our patients to understand. It's what the whole body of research shows us. So nutrition is hard to study, and I think patients may not understand some of the differences between what is a good quality study and what is a bad quality study. And I think that the other piece of the puzzle is that nutrition is rarely decided with the randomized controlled trials that we like to see in medicine. So often we're looking to the placebo-controlled, blinded, randomized trial to understand a cause and effect. In nutrition, that's very hard to do. Even if you set up a study and you randomize people to eat a particular diet or not eat a particular diet, they know what they're eating. And the other thing is, just because you tell someone what to eat doesn't mean they actually do it. So getting patients or study subjects who are participating in a nutrition study to follow to the letter or exactly what we're telling them to do is pretty difficult, because even if you give them lots of information and coaching, everybody lives freely out in the world and they're influenced by all sorts of different things, and nobody is going to follow a particular diet, even if it's for a study, 100%. So it's very difficult to get cause and effect from any single study, but we can look at the body of evidence that is out there. And I want to focus a little bit on consistency. So of course, these other areas are important as well to kind of communicate. How strong is that association? Sometimes patients will hear something in the news about X food and Y outcome of a particular cancer, and it might be a really small finding. In other words, it's not a very strong association. Consistency is key. I'll talk about that a little bit more. Temporality, in other words, with a lot of studies with nutrition, you look backwards in time and you say, here's a group of cancer patients, here's a group of people who don't have cancer. What did you eat 10 years ago or 20 years ago? that doesn't really give us cause and effect, because people's memories are faulty. And oftentimes you have a recall bias where a patient who has cancer might recall something differently than someone who doesn't. Also, is there a dose response? Do you get, the more you eat or of a certain diet or pattern, do you have particular increasing or decreasing risk? And then plausibility. Is it even plausible? So I always share the story, when you study epidemiology, one of the first examples they give you is that when lung cancer was first being diagnosed in the, at large numbers beginning in the middle of the 20th century, people thought that there might be a connection with coffee. And it turns out that, there's not a lot of biologic plausibility or coherence to the idea that coffee is going to cause lung cancer. However, at least in the United States, in our culture, people often would have coffee and cigarettes together. So coffee and tobacco went together. So it's plausible that tobacco causes lung cancer. It's not so plausible that coffee does. So we have to look at what is being shared in the media and in the research, and does it even make sense in terms of plausibility? And do you understand all of those confounders or those things around that association? So I think that's important for patients to understand, like, is that even biologically plausible? As far as consistency, so this is just an example of something called a forest plot. And I like to share it because it gives you an idea of what the research might look like in an area where there's a really strong association between an exposure and an outcome. So smoking and lung cancer, everybody who works in science would agree smoking causes lung cancer. And so if you see all of the studies over to the right, so if you look at this plot of information, that middle line is a relative risk of 1, which means there's no association whatsoever. You can look at that factor and look at the outcome, and there's no increase or decrease risk. If you look to the left, you see that if that exposure falls on the left, that's reduced risk. So that would be like a relative risk of less than 1.5, for example. And if you look to the right, those are the things that are positive associations, meaning when you have that exposure, you have an increased risk. So that would be something like 1.5 or 5 or 10. So most of the research on lung cancer and smoking falls all the way over there, far, far to the right. In other words, all of the research agrees pretty consistently that smoking causes lung cancer. But you get the occasional study, for whatever reason, maybe it's a poorly run study, maybe there's other confounders that they don't account for, where you'll get something way off to the left, or maybe right in the middle where it shows that smoking is not associated with lung cancer. So you have to ask, if you read a news story and it is about one of those studies, which are represented by the dots, and it's one of the ones that's kind of out there all by itself and it doesn't agree with anything else, that's not going to tell you the true connection between that exposure and that outcome. In other words, smoking and lung cancer. So it's important for patients to understand we've got this whole group of studies on nutrition and cancer that tell us general ideas about what is helpful for reducing risk of cancer and what is harmful in terms of increasing risk of cancer. And every now and then you'll see a study that doesn't agree. It's way out to the left or way out to the right, and it doesn't bunch up with the other studies. And that's really important for patients to understand, because they may read about that one study, but if they don't understand what the entire body of literature tells us, then they are not going to get the full picture. On the opposite side, you could look at something like physical activity and heart disease. And this is incident heart disease or new heart disease, not someone with existing heart disease. So for people without heart disease, regular physical activity or regular exercise reduces risk. Maybe there's one study that's way over to the right that says, hey, if you exercise a lot, you get more heart disease. We know that that's not true, but that might be the one study that someone decides to read, or that someone presents to them in a media story. And unfortunately, those studies that don't agree with all the rest of the research tend to be the ones that get the most press or get most coverage by the media. So patients are often influenced by these studies that really don't represent what we know about a particular topic. So that's, I think, an important kind of framework for what we talk about with nutrition and cancer, because most of what we're talking about is not a very strong, clear-cut association or cause and effect in the same way that smoking is for lung cancer, for example, or in the same way that physical activity is for reducing heart disease risk. So the first myth I'm going to tackle is sugar feeds cancer. This is really common. I've been working in the oncology field for more than 2 decades, 20 plus years. And I have heard this from the day I started, and I still continue to hear it today. And it's a frustrating myth because there is a little kernel of truth in there. And I think those are the hardest myths to help patients understand, is that when maybe there's a little bit of truth, but the big picture is much more complex, it's hard for patients to understand where that fits into their diet. So when we look at the connection between sugar and cancer outcomes, this is what we see. So if you remember back to these association plots of each of those dots is an individual study, most of the research falls in one direction or the other. When you look at the connection between sugar and cancer, this is what you see. Most of the research clusters around that middle point, which means there's really not a strong association between sugar, added sugar intake and cancer outcome. So a person might see 1 or 2 studies that show that, oh, sugar's really bad, it causes cancer. But then you look at the body of research and there's not a strong connection. So helping patients understand that is really important. And I think the thing we have to look at is that the kernel of truth, or there's always a little bit of truth in some of these myths. So does sugar feed cancer? Not really, not in the sense of it's the only thing that cancer cells are going to use and it always feeds cancer. So the answer is no in general. However, if you want to look at it more broadly, does sugar feed cancer cells? Yes, of course it feeds cancer cells because sugar feeds every cell in our body. Our bodies use carbohydrate for energy. So the question of sugar feeds cancer, you can say, sure, it does, but it also feeds all of our normal cells. It feeds your brain cells and your muscles and your bones. So yes, in a sense, it does feed cancer, but not because it's anything special, because cancer cells also use protein and they also use fat. And so in this sense, sugar is not going to specifically feed cancer more than other nutrients for the most part. And so I think it's important for patients to understand that cancer cells are flexible. They can adapt to their environment. So if you cut out all carbohydrates, the question is, are those cancer cells then just going to shift their metabolism and burn fat instead? Or are they going to shift and use protein? So we can manipulate the diet, but whether that does anything to a cancer cell is not really answered. We don't really know if that's true. And the other question is, when we look at the big body of literature, I think of one research paper that I've shared the citation with down there in the bottom right of the slide is a really large comprehensive review paper that was published in 2019 in the European Journal of Clinical Nutrition, which is a fantastic journal that has a lot of terrific research. This was a really comprehensive review paper, and it found the conclusion is there at the bottom. Taken together, current scientific evidence does not support the conclusion that dietary sugars per se are detrimental to human health. And this paper looked at all of the research, hundreds and hundreds of papers on sugar and cancer, sugar and heart disease, sugar and even diabetes, and did not find that sugar in and of itself is the problem. So I think that's important to note for cancer patients, that just focusing on one nutrient is probably too simple, and we need to look at how sugar fits into the total diet. So it's not that sugar isn't bad. If you have lots of sugar in your diet, that's not good either. But we know that just cutting out all sugar, you can't expect that that's automatically going to mean that your cancer risk drops, because the research is not very clear on that at all. And generally, when you see a plot like this, where the research kind of falls all along the middle, or it's kind of all around that point of no association whatsoever, that means that the true association is not very strong in either direction. There might be a little effect, but that effect is so small that no one study can really even pick it up. So you look at the totality of evidence, and all of that evidence does not point to sugar being a big problem. However, I do point out that malnutrition can make it harder for the body to recover from chemotherapy, surgery, radiation therapy, and other medical interventions. So sugar and carbohydrates make up roughly 50% of a typical diet in the Western world, and that would include the United States, but also Sweden. And we know that if you cut out the one category of food, carbohydrates, including all sugars, that provide typically half of our calorie intake, it's really hard to maintain your weight. That's why low carbohydrate diets can work so well. When you cut out half of where your calories come from, you tend to go into a calorie deficit, or to be at a point where you lose weight. And so we know that losing weight aggressively during cancer treatment is not helpful. And we do know that when you lose weight aggressively or, at a high rate during cancer treatment, that can lead to malnutrition and your body does not respond to therapy as well. So I think it's really important for patients to prioritize what's your priority. When you're in cancer treatment, you do not want to experience malnutrition because that will make your surgery, healing from surgery harder. Malnutrition will make your chemotherapy less effective. It's proven. And again, I don't have all the time to go into all the research, but there are dozens of studies showing that chemotherapy and radiation therapy are less effective when you have malnutrition. So we really want patients to understand that if you cut out all of these foods, you are going to hinder your treatment and make it less effective. So that's really important to remember. So dietary supplements, a lot of people put their energy into dietary supplements, and that's really, really popular here in the United States. And we don't have very strong laws against what kinds of claims dietary supplement makers and manufacturers can make. And so sometimes you get some really crazy claims regarding what nutrition and dietary supplements can do, including things like cure cancer, which we know there's no evidence for that. So I'm going to give a couple examples. Antioxidants are a popular category, and then I'm going to talk just for a few minutes about probiotics. So the antioxidant story is really interesting. And some of you listening may be too young to even remember when these studies were coming out, but I was in graduate school at the time, and I was working in a carotenoid lab or a keratin lab. So I was working in a laboratory analyzing blood samples for levels of these nutrients when this research was going on and when it was reported. And knowing everything I knew about carotenoids or keratins, my student advisor was an expert, a world expert in this topic. I knew that these studies were not going to yield the results that people were expecting or wanted. And that's because when you take individual nutrients in isolation, you rarely get the effect that you would get when you find them in food. And so there were two large randomized controlled double-blinded trials, the gold standard of research. And CARROT was one that was going on in the United States, and ATBC was going on in Finland. And they both enrolled high-risk individuals for lung cancer. And the reason they picked that is they wanted the outcomes, or in other words, getting cancer to happen faster. And people who are at high risk of lung cancer, who have a long history of smoking, are more likely to get their cancer within the window of study that you're looking at. And so it was a good population to try to see results fast. And so it helps because sometimes when you do cancer research, you have to wait 10, 20, 30 years. Well, this study was designed with people who were already at high risk. And what they found is when you gave people some of these antioxidant nutrients, in particular the beta carotene, the alpha tocopherol, which is vitamin E, and vitamin A, what they found was that not only did it not decrease cancer risk, it increased lung cancer risk. So it did the exact opposite of what the researchers thought. And when those results came out, I was not surprised. And I also had a chuckle or a good laugh because I saw all of my physician colleagues being really surprised. And I knew that's because they look at this type of research, they look at nutrients in isolation, but you can't understand what a nutrient's going to do if you don't look at what it does in food. And so I call it doubling down or putting all of your money down on antioxidants. So another study came out in the mid 2000s, and you would think after this study that people might have gotten the idea, gosh, maybe we shouldn't give a lot of antioxidants, especially not to a population that has a lot of history of smoking, because clearly in this population, at least in people who smoke, these nutrients are not helpful and they may even be harmful. So in head and neck cancer patients, to prevent second primary cancers, in other words, not a recurrence of the head and neck, but to prevent a new cancer, research, a randomized controlled trial looked at vitamin E, beta carotene, and I still marvel, I think, wow, we didn't learn our lesson in the 90s from those other studies. And what they found was, not surprisingly, and again, I point out the smoking piece because that's important, because smoking is a very unique population in terms of their risk factors. And head and neck cancer patients, at least back when this study was going on, smoking was the main risk factor. Now the epidemiology has changed, and we have some head and neck cancers that are due to virus and HPV or human papillomavirus. But back in the late 90s and early 2000s, when this study was happening, most of the risk was coming from smoking and or high intake of alcohol. And as with the other studies, the ones that were looking at primary prevention, these two, CARROT and ATBC, this study also found results that were not what might have been expected. During supplementation, the group that got the supplements, especially the vitamin E, were nearly 3 times more likely to get another cancer. But interestingly, after supplementation ended, they decided, wow, this does not seem to help people at all. Let's stop the trial and stop giving them these nutrients, but we'll continue to follow them. After supplementation, they actually saw second primary risk drop. And interestingly, we saw also that in the supplement group, 86% more likely in the intervention group to get not just a new primary cancer, but a second, but a recurrence and or a second primary. And then after they cut the supplementation off and followed people over time, they said, oh, they're 29% less likely to get a recurrence. So very confusing picture. Maybe the timing matters, how close it is to treatment. We don't know. But after 8 years of following these people, we can say, we don't know. But with that potential risk of increasing, we probably shouldn't supplement people aggressively with these antioxidant nutrients. So this was a really good example of how complex this question is. And so when you look at, what did we miss? When we look at why did we go down this path of studying beta carotene, vitamin E, vitamin C, vitamin A, some of these nutrients with strong antioxidant properties in the first place? Well, that's because beta carotene dietary intake, and you can ignore that word plasma, that's a typo. Beta carotene dietary intake, in other words, when you measure diet and how much beta carotene people are getting, it decreases lung cancer risk. Yet when you measure getting it from supplements, it increases lung cancer risk. So even right within the same studies, those findings about supplements versus diet, they are exactly the opposite. And that's probably because beta carotene alone may do different things than it does when it's mixed with all the other nutrients in food. And beta carotene might be a marker for other things that are in that food that have cancer preventing properties. And when you take that out, you lose that benefit. We also know that if you look by smoking, there's probably an interaction between smoking and some of these nutrients. So we know that in people who don't smoke, in some trials, the polyp prevention trial, so that's for colorectal cancer, we found that the adverse effects of supplementing were mainly seen in smokers, but not in non-smokers. So there's a complication there. So these antioxidant nutrients, they do have effects. They can have interactions with other things in the diet and in the lifestyle. And so we can't really conclude, well, everybody needs antioxidants or everybody doesn't need antioxidants. It's a very complex picture. And so to err on the side of being safe, we don't want people to take large doses of these types of nutrients. So some theories on why there's retinoid metabolism, that's vitamin A, and how that's important for signaling pathways in cancer and in regular cells. So maybe something about giving extra, change those signaling pathways in cancer cells, and maybe it did it in a favorable way so that cancer was worse. Physiologic versus pharmacologic. So what you get from a food versus what you get when you take a big dose that you might get from a supplement, very different effects. You can have differences in that. The cytochrome P450 enzymes seem to be affected by high doses of some of these nutrients. So you might change how your body metabolizes or processes other types of substances, whether that's medications or other nutrients. Pro-oxidative effects of tobacco. In other words, maybe antioxidants don't work like antioxidants when you couple it with smoking. Maybe we didn't look at the right animal model. So when we first studied this and said, oh, maybe these things prevent cancer, it might have been an animal model that doesn't look like a human, doesn't really work like a human in terms of cancer. It might be that progression of existing tumors, maybe if you don't have cancer to begin with, antioxidants are good, and if you have cancer, they're bad. That's a particular theory that might contribute to why you would see problems with giving antioxidants in people with existing cancer. And then the other one, this is my favorite theory, and I really enjoy it and think it's a good theory because I've read a lot about it, is that oxidation seems to trigger cell repair. So when you have oxidation, your cells get a message that says there's damage, turn on the repair. So if you suppress that mechanism and you stop that from happening by giving lots of antioxidants, you might actually take away one way that your body is helping to repair itself or telling itself to repair. So with the smoking, that makes perfect sense. If you have smoke that causes oxidation, that tells your cells to repair themselves, so it gives you a little bit of protection against things like what that smoke is doing. Then you add antioxidants and you take away that signal that's telling the cells to repair themselves. It's the perfect storm, so to speak, or the perfect combination that sets you up for cancer. That's a theory I think holds a lot of weight, and I think it makes a lot of sense biologically. So probiotics, I think, are interesting, and I always start out with, there's no evidence, as a statement that I often hear about probiotics. And is that true or false? Well, interestingly, it couldn't be further from the truth in terms of evidence, because there are hundreds of studies on probiotics, and some of them are good quality randomized controlled trials. And that's because, unlike diet, where you can tell someone to follow a diet, that doesn't mean they necessarily are eating exactly what you want them to eat. With a pill or a probiotic that you might get in a food, that you could put the probiotic in one version of the food but not in another, you can get people to be blinded. They might not know what they're getting. So probiotic research, there is evidence there. So that statement, there's no evidence, that's false. There is evidence. And I give you a few examples here. There's some interesting research, and I just gave you the citations for those, that show that probiotics may actually help with diarrhea for some cancer patients. That's great news if we can help patients not experience some of those symptoms and side effects of going through treatment. Prevention of acute radiation-induced diarrhea for cervical cancer patients, there's some evidence that it can help with that. Prophylactic, or giving them in advance with antibiotics versus antibiotics alone for colorectal cancer surgery, suggests that the probiotics, sometimes we give patients antibiotics because they're about to go into surgery. Maybe they have infections or other things to worry about. Whether you give them probiotics, antibiotics, there's some evidence that if you're giving someone a strong antibiotic, maybe supplementing with some of those bacteria that you're killing off with those antibiotics can be helpful in terms of their recovery and their ability to heal. So those are some examples of some studies that show some benefits of probiotics. This is an interesting product that was studied back in the mid-2000s that it's called Yakult, and we have it here in the United States. I don't know if you have it in Sweden, but it is in the grocery store mixed in with the yogurt section of the grocery store, and it's out of Japan, and it has Lactobacillus casei, which is a particular lactobacillus species. And they looked at this for having patients drink one of these drinks every day, and looked at survival after treatment for bladder cancer. And what they found was that the recurrence-free survival, in other words, the people how long they went up to 3 years, how many people had recurred or had their cancer come back by that point in time, 3 years, versus those who hadn't, it made a huge difference. So they found that those folks who got the probiotic drink actually did have a better 3-year recurrence-free survival. And so that's really exciting. However, when they looked at them over time, looking at progression-free survival, meaning how quickly, not only did it just recur, but did it progress, that disease, once it did recur, and they didn't see a difference, and they did not see a difference in overall survival. So again, it's a very complex picture. I think there's some more study that needs to be done on this particular probiotic, but I think it's exciting that, okay, maybe there's something there. If someone's getting a bone marrow transplant or a stem cell transplant, they can look at their stool samples and look at their microbiome, and they can predict pretty accurately, based on their microbiota, or the bugs or the microbes in their gut, who is going to get graft versus host disease. And that is a very serious complication. And so if you can look at someone's makeup of their gut microbiome or their gut bacteria and say, you're more likely to get graft versus host, that's a really strong and powerful predictor. However, what we don't know is, can you alter that? Can you give people probiotics and change that? We don't know. There's not solid evidence yet. But there are some ongoing trials that I urge people to pay attention to, because I think this is going to be an area where we might be able to improve people's outcomes by helping alter their microbiome. And interestingly, the microbiota, the general pattern, there's a lot of little individual things that come out, but the general pattern is that the more rich and varied your microbiome is, the better you do. So in other words, having a lot of different bugs or a lot of different microbes in your gut is helpful. And what is the best way to get microbes in your gut to be robust and to have a lot of different species? That's to eat lots of fruits and vegetables and whole foods. So we know for a fact that people who eat fruits, vegetables, whole grains, all the things that feed those healthy gut bacteria, those people tend to have a very broad, healthy microbiome. So we don't know if you can give a particular pill to give people those microbes, but we do know that if you have a diet that supports good gut health, that should be helpful. So I think that's a good takeaway message. Immunotherapy is also interesting. We know that antibiotics, when you give them before or during when you're giving immunotherapy, people have worse outcomes. But interestingly, recent research shows that probiotics also can make outcomes worse in immunotherapy. So I caution people, don't take probiotics if you're getting immunotherapy, because we don't know which ones are helpful. There is some research on something called Akkermansia muciniphila, that is a bug or a microbe in the gut, that having a lot of that bug seem to be helpful, and the antibiotics that kill off that bug maybe make the outcomes worse for some of these immunotherapy drugs. So I think that's an interesting finding. Would I tell patients to supplement Akkermansia muciniphila? No, I would not, because we don't know that if we give a lot of that, if that's going to be the same effect as if it's naturally occurring in the gut. So I think that's a thread or a research area we need to follow, but I would not recommend it for patients at this point in time. So one of my other kind of favorite myths along with sugar is soy, because this myth has persisted for decades, and it's very frustrating because not only is it not true, but in general, the research is very clear that the opposite is true. So I think the question that patients get tripped up on is whether or not these foods have estrogenic or hormonal effects. So I think it's important for people to understand that soy is not a hormone. It doesn't contain estrogen. It contains nutrients that might look a little bit like estrogen, and they can interact with some of our estrogen receptors on our cells, but these foods are not estrogen. So people need to understand that. And I also think that when you look at one effect of the food in the same way that you look at one nutrient, you're not seeing the full picture. What other things does that food bring to the table in terms of beneficial or detrimental effects for health? And then the other question is, what do you mean by estrogenic effects? The research is pretty rich in this area, and there are lots of different versions of estrogen receptors on cells, but two general categories are alpha estrogen receptors and beta estrogen receptors. And it turns out that in your breasts, your endometrium, in your uterus, that you have a lot of alpha estrogen receptors. In your bones and in your brain and in your cardiovascular system, you tend to have more beta estrogen receptors. It turns out that soy tends to preferentially bind with those beta estrogen receptors, at least in the cell and animal studies that we can look at to get an idea of mechanistically, or what's the mechanism. And so it's interesting that people focus on estrogenic, but it turns out it's not probably interacting very strongly with the types of estrogen receptors that you'd be worried about for a hormone-related cancer. And then the big picture, what else does soy do? So the research shows, and I've just listed a laundry list of things. I won't go into them in detail because I don't have time, but anti-angiogenesis, and anyone who studies cancer knows angiogenesis is an area of interest and intervention. There are some drugs that work this way by cutting off the ability of tumor cells to grow blood vessels, and that can help slow them down. So we know that soy seems to have these effects of blocking some of these pathways in the cells, these VEGF and epidermal growth factor pathways that can make cancer worse. So that's one activity. It can induce cell cycle arrest and apoptosis, or cell death, and by working through a particular pathway, at least again in animal and lab studies. I caution people that doesn't mean it always does this in humans, but these are some of the activities we think are mechanisms that are happening. soy appears to have some tyrosine kinase inhibiting activity. And we know there's a lot of drugs and new research in the tyrosine kinase inhibitor area. It's got antioxidants in it. It actually binds and activates some of these PPRs, or these peroxisome proliferator regulators. It's hard to even say that, but those are important for regulating cell behavior, and regulating them can better and more tightly can help reduce cancer cell growth. They inhibit enzymes in the endogenous steroid pathway, so they tend to slow down the production of some types of estrogen. So that can be helpful. If you have an estrogen-sensitive cancer, it can naturally put up one more barrier for how much estrogen your body is producing. And again, this is to point out, not to get people wound up and say, wow, I should eat soy to treat my cancer. That's not what we're saying. What we are saying is these are things that soy may do in the body that have nothing to do with hormones, and that may be beneficial. They upregulate, soy compounds can upregulate natural killer cell function, inhibit metastasis, and upregulate the production, or turn on the production of sex hormone binding globulin. And that's something that binds estrogen so that it doesn't interact with the cells. So the more sex hormone binding globulin, or SHBG, that you have, the less active estrogen you have running around. So I point these out not to say you should use soy as a medicine, you shouldn't, but to point out that when people just say soy's estrogen, they're missing this big picture. And when you look at research in humans, and again, I always say, look at that big picture of evidence. There's a lot of research on this. And these are some studies following patients with breast cancer. The WELL is the Women's Healthy Eating and Living Study. The LACE is a study out of California. And then the CANG study is out of China. So you've got different populations, and that's important because Asian populations tend to eat soy earlier in their life, whereas Western populations don't tend to have it in the diet maybe until a little later. So you've got different types of populations. That's good. You want to see the big picture in lots of different people. You've got varying levels and types of soy food consumption. You've got varying ways that this intake was measured. And again, these are observational studies, they're not interventions. But what they do show is when you look at these big studies over many, many years, across the board, soy intake, when you do a food intake questionnaire and you follow people over time, soy intake is associated with reduced risk of recurrence. So soy, that question drives me crazy. Does soy cause or worsen breast cancer? Because not only does it not cause or worsen it, if anything, it may be protective. Now, again, I say possibly beneficial because I would not say the evidence, they're not controlled trials, so they're not strong enough for us to say you definitely need to add soy. But what they do, they give us reassurance that if people want to eat soy, there's no problem if they want to include it in their diet. And it also can help breast cancer patients feel less concerned about what is in food that they're eating. I have worked with patients who read every label on the food and get caught up in and nervous about the soy. And I always reassure them, if there's a little soy in something, it's not going to harm you. Soy supplements are different. I would not recommend taking soy supplements. These studies are intervention where they actually gave people soy, and they didn't find nipple aspirate or fluid that you can get out of a nipple. They didn't see a change in the volume of that, and they did not see a change in the estrogen levels in that. So the soy, when women were on the diet where they were getting the soy, they didn't have any changes in those levels in their breasts. And when you look at meta-analysis, in other words, you take lots of different studies, and 4 of those included risk of recurrence. And again, that's looking at that big picture. All of the research points in the direction of soy being helpful, if anything at all. And we don't believe it's harmful. So I always encourage patients, it's your choice. If you like soy, eat soy. If you don't like soy, don't eat soy. I personally like it. I like Asian food and I eat tofu all the time. But some people don't like it. So I think it's important for patients to understand it's a choice and you don't need to worry either way. And now thinking about this last topic here, the details of metabolic manipulation, or kind of taking our macronutrients, our protein, our carbohydrate, and our fat, and manipulating it by taking one of those components way up or way down with a ketogenic diet, a low carb diet, or fasting. This is a really new area of research. And I think what matters is the details of fasting. So is it a true fast where you're eating nothing? there's a big body of research now building up around fasting mimicking diets, where you can have a little bit of food, but you minimize the amount of protein and carbs and get more, and have it be a little bit of fat. And people like fasting mimicking diets. They're a little easier to follow than a strict water fast where you get nothing at all. Is there a theoretical benefit? Yes, there is a theoretical benefit versus the available evidence. And I'll tell you about that in a minute here. And it's interesting because this is a quote I pulled from a lecture that I went to about 2 years ago. And they talked about, the role of fasting in cancer is to be cautious because of the risk of malnutrition and sarcopenia, or wasting or loss of lean body mass, may be associated. So the question is, maybe fasting is helpful for some people, but what if they're malnourished? Which patients? Some patients, I would say breast cancer patients, don't tend to lose as much weight. Some do, but by and large, they tend to be pretty stable with their weight and their nutrition status. Maybe those folks or those people can fast and be safe. What about a head and neck cancer patient? What about a lung cancer patient? What about a pancreatic cancer patient? I would say that those people who tend to not be able to get enough nutrition, maybe fasting is not such a good idea. We don't have the evidence. There are studies going on, so we're gonna learn more about that. But I always say unintentional weight loss is a good marker. So there's intentional weight loss where you're trying to lose weight with a diet, and there's unintentional weight loss, which we see in our cancer patients, where no matter what they do, despite their best efforts, they continue to lose weight. That unintentional weight loss is probably a good marker that that person might not be a good candidate for fasting. And if they've had prior weight loss and malnutrition, that may be a problem. And do you do it during treatment or after treatment? There's all of these questions. Does a type of diet or supplement have biologic plausibility, or does it make sense? And this does make sense. So normal cells, when you fast or deprive them of calories and energy, they go into senescence and they reduce their growth. And there's some theory that this would protect them from the cytotoxic cancer treatments, including chemotherapy and radiation. So if those cells, when you're fasting, your normal cells shut down because they're not getting nutrients, they're not going to be taken up and be bombarded with as much of that treatment. Cancer cells, of course, the hallmark of cancer is unregulated, uncontrolled growth and replication. So cancer cells, even when you fast, they are not as good at reducing their growth. They just kind of keep going. And so they could be not as affected by the fasting. So what you might be able to do, and this is the theory, is protect your regular cells and harm your cancer cells, or go after your cancer cells, because they get that metabolic stress from the fasting, but they can't shut down like a normal cell. So there's some evidence that that might happen. And then systemically, or in your body systemically, the whole body, we know that when people fast, they have less inflammation, and they do tend to have upregulation of something called Tregs, or T cells that are regulatory, that seems to improve how well your CD8 T cells, or those are your natural killer cells, are able to recognize cancer and go after it. So there's some theory that, yeah, you'd actually boost your immune system if you fast. But again, these are theories, these are animal studies, and these are theories. They're not proven in all humans, and we don't know if they're different in different types of cancer. So with a ketogenic diet, I think it's important to look at what type it is. Is it conventional or very, very, very low carbohydrate, like less than 20 grams per carbohydrate a day, versus modified, where it's a little bit more open and allows for a little bit more carbohydrate? What tumor type does? WINS and WELL are two studies in breast cancer that are very large studies that have followed women for many, many years. Those are important to look at, those studies to look at kind of dietary manipulation. Does a calorically adequate ketogenic diet, in other words, if you're not losing weight on a ketogenic diet, does it do the same thing as fasting? We don't know that. And part of the reason is because ketogenic diets make people lose weight. So if you lose weight and you don't control for that weight loss, you don't know, is it the ketogenic diet or is it the weight loss? We don't really know. So we don't know if it's going to have the same effect as pure fasting. Does a calorically adequate ketogenic diet protect normal cells the same way fasting might? How long should you follow the diet? Should it be just during treatment? Or once someone's done with treatment, are you telling them they need to follow a ketogenic diet forever? Because that's a pretty hard diet to follow. People can manage to do it for dieting or weight loss purposes for a year, 2 years, 3 years. But if you're talking about 20 years after a cancer diagnosis for a cancer survivor, are you telling them they should never eat carbohydrates again? That's a lot to ask, and we don't even know if it works. Special case is when you look at drugs called PI3K inhibitors, and that's phosphatidylinositol 3 kinase inhibitors. That's a big mouthful, but they're very new, and they're showing a lot of promise for certain types of cancer. But the problem is when you give people these drugs, you have a lot of insulin resistance. And when you give insulin to help the patient not have diabetes, or to control their diabetes that they get from the drug, the insulin reduces the effect of the drug. So it's this feedback loop where you give the drug, their blood sugar, their blood glucose shoots up very high. You give them insulin, it brings the glucose down, and then the drug stops working. And there's some evidence, and I've given you a study here. It's the study in Nature that's by Hopkins, that when you combine, and this is a mouse study, so it doesn't prove that it happens in humans, but it's very compelling evidence that if you are on a PI3K inhibitor and you put someone on a ketogenic diet, you get rid of that toxic effect of insulin resistance and the drug works better. So I would say if you have a patient that's taking one of these drugs, you don't necessarily need to do a full ketogenic diet, but do you want to limit carbohydrates? You might want to try that, especially if you see a lot of insulin resistance. And if it were me, I would probably do that. So I think there's some cases where you say, yeah, maybe this can everybody. We don't really know for sure if that's going to work. So we need more understanding. There's just a small number of studies. There's some promise there, I think, for certain tumor types. But interestingly, there are some studies that show that certain tumor cells can use ketones for energy, and they use ketones very effectively. There's also some research in animals showing that ketones may promote metastasis or the cancer spreading. Those are in cell and animal studies, so we don't know if that happens in humans. But I think just saying absolutely do a ketogenic diet is not a good idea. I think we need to pick and choose who might be a good candidate. And if someone has a lot of insulin resistance and has a lot of issues with diabetes and those issues that can crop up during cancer treatment due to some of the drugs, the steroids, these PI3K inhibitors, maybe a ketogenic diet is not a bad idea. Or if not, if you don't want to do a full ketogenic diet, maybe a carbohydrate limited diet. So cut back the carbohydrates so that they have less insulin resistance. If you put someone on a very low calorie diet, or not low calorie, excuse me, if you put someone on a very low carbohydrate diet, you are cutting out from the category of foods that tend to provide about half of our usual intake or energy. So it's very hard to cut carbohydrates drastically and not lose weight. That's why these diets are so popular for dieting and for losing weight, is because they cause weight loss. So if someone, and this is my thing that I think is so important to remember, I always come back to this particular categorization to help us decide which patients may be appropriate for some type of diet intervention like fasting or a ketogenic diet or a carbohydrate restricted diet. Are they losing weight unintentionally or without trying? That is a very different picture metabolically than if they are trying to diet. And on the left, you see what happens when you diet and you don't have the stresses and the pressures of cancer. You use up fat and a little bit of lean body mass or muscle tissue, but your body very quickly regulates up the fat burning enzymes. It turns on fatty acid oxidase, and it helps burn up fat and preserve lean tissue. So that's a good adaptation. And your hunger hormones turn on to tell you it's time to eat. When you have unintentional weight loss, that shift from burning fat, or rather burning fat and lean, to just burning fat doesn't really happen. You just keep burning lean tissues along with some of the fat. So If you are unintentionally losing weight, that means you have a lot of pro-inflammatory things going on in the body. You've got a lot of inflammation. You don't upregulate those fat-burning enzymes, and you continue to use that lean tissue, and you do not protect that lean tissue, and you don't respond to hunger hormones. So I think it's important for people to know that if you're unintentionally losing weight, that diet might have a very different effect than if you're losing weight by trying with a diet. This is some evidence from a study in the United States called the WHEL study, W-H-E-L, Women's Healthy Eating and Living Study. And what it shows is that you can look at, it's 3,000 plus breast cancer survivors who were put on different diets. One was a very high plant-based diet, had lots of fruits and vegetables. The other was a standard healthy diet with 5 fruits and vegetables a day. And what this shows is that when they categorize the people by whether they had low vegetable and fruit intake and low physical activity, whether they had low vegetable and fruit intake and high physical activity, those are the people that I say are the people who exercise, but they don't eat very well. Or you can have people who have high fruit and vegetable intake, but they don't exercise a lot. Those are your people who don't, they're not very physically active, but they eat pretty well. And then you can have people who do both. They eat well and they exercise. And when you categorize people and look at the outcomes from this research, what it showed is that the benefit of losing a lot of weight or not being obese and not being overweight disappeared. In other words, in this last category, all the way to the right on this graph, when you look at mortality over time in breast cancer survivors, we know that obesity can be a problem and can increase risk of recurrence and death. If people exercise and eat well, they can not lose a single pound and still get the protective benefit of a healthy lifestyle. This study was just revolutionary in terms of showing that even in these people in that dark blue category, they didn't lose a single pound. This was not a weight loss study, but simply by following a healthy diet and exercising, even if they didn't lose any weight, and most of them did not lose any weight, they still got the protection of those healthy lifestyle behaviors. So I think that's really important. And the other thing that is a good takeaway from this, something you can share with your patients, is high fruit and vegetable intake was 5 fruits and vegetables a day. So it's not that high. It's not that you have to be a vegetarian or a vegan. It just means you need to regularly eat fruits and vegetables. And high physical activity was equivalent to about 45 minutes of brisk walking every day. So this is very doable. It is the kind of thing that you can help your patients do. And even if they don't lose a single pound, which weight loss is hard and we know it's hard, they still get the benefit of those healthy behaviors. So I always encourage patients, don't look at the scale, just do the behaviors because you will get the benefit. I think that's important for us to message that and share that with people. So the last thing I want to share with you is just how we share this information, because I do think that it's very easy to be dismissive or to, maybe roll our eyes at a patient and think, oh, that's ridiculous. Because once you get working in this field for any length of time, you think that you've seen it all in terms of the funny diets and different supplements people might do. And as soon as you think you've seen it all, someone will come in with something new that's completely crazy and, out there and doesn't make any sense. And it's very easy to get jaded or kind of have a feeling of, oh, this is so dumb. I can't believe they're doing this. But I think it's important to remember there's only one reason why patients do any particular approach for anything in terms of helping themselves with cancer. And that one reason is because they think it's going to help. Nobody would willingly take a supplement, do an extreme diet, fast, do anything that we might think of as being very weird and out there and potentially even dangerous. Nobody would do that. No patient would do that if they didn't believe it would help. So keeping that in mind, I think, is the single most important way to communicate with your patient, is to understand they think it's going to help. And if you take that framework, you can be more compassionate and help them understand why it may or may not help. I think complimenting patients on their initiative. So if a patient comes in wanting to try or do something very that's not in the normal realm of what we think of as helpful, Maybe they want to take a bunch of supplements. Maybe they want to do a particular extreme diet. I think the starting point isn't that won't work. The better starting point is, I'm so glad that you are engaged with your care and that you want to do what you can do to keep your body healthy. That's how you set the tone. And then you start to get into the specifics of, tell me why you want to take that supplement. Tell me why you want to do that diet. Where have you read about that? What have you heard about that? Just expressing an interest and listening with an open mind, and harnessing self-help, getting patients to understand that they have some power and they can do some certain things, and you're there to guide them to pick and choose what's most helpful. Know the nocebo. I don't know if many of you are familiar with this, but the nocebo effect. We're all familiar with the placebo effect, or the placebo that can happen where you give someone an inactive supplement or product, and if they're in the placebo arm, they don't even get the medication, and they still report having side effects, or they still report that they got an effect of the drug. The nocebo effect is the opposite, and that is where when people in the placebo group get all of the negative parts of something because they think or they've been told that there's going to be side effects or downsides. So there's evidence that suggests that if you give negative messaging to a patient while they are interested in something, and you say, oh, don't try that, don't do that, you can actually affect their physiology and make it harder for their body to be healthy. We know for a fact that words are powerful. And so if you give someone an intervention and you say, hey, let's give this a try, let's see how it works, you're going to get a much better effect than if you give someone an intervention and you say, this is probably not going to work, I don't even know why we're trying. So that negative messaging will actually impact how well the patient reacts to a particular intervention, whether that be a medication or a diet or a supplement. So it's an entire field. And again, I am not an expert in it and I don't have time to go in it, but there's a whole body of literature called psychoneuroimmunology. It's a big word. And it's all around how the brain affects the body and affects the immune system. And so I think we need to keep in mind that what we share with patients and how we share it can make a difference while the patient does. And finally, safety. Is this going to interact with their treatments? Is it safe for them? Do they have malnutrition? Goals. I always ask the patient, what is your goal in taking this supplement? What is your goal in following this diet? What is your goal in avoiding this food or adding in this food? Just so you understand what they're trying to do. And then documenting. I have lots of patients that I've worked with who I will tell them without, mincing words, I'll tell them in no uncertain terms, I don't think it's a good idea to take that particular product. And they will tell me, I'm going to take it anyway. And that's okay. That's their decision. I'm there to facilitate and provide information. But in the end, the patients are going to do what they want to do. And so I think what we need to do is understand that we should document that we've shared our concerns, or we, educated the patient, and document, Mrs. Smith, that would be in the United States, wants to take this particular supplement, or Mrs. Smith wants to follow this diet. I've advised that I do not think this is a good idea. Mrs. Smith has told me that she's going to go ahead and continue with that particular plan of action. And the reason I think that's important is because you want that to be in the record. You want that to the patient record to reflect that you've done your due diligence and that the patient has decided they want to follow someone else's advice. And the reason that's so important is research shows if you tell a patient not to do something and then just shut them down and say, don't take it, it's really harmful, I wouldn't do that, and then you just walk away, and then you come back later and say, are you taking it? They may tell you they're not taking it even when they are. And it's not that a patient wants to lie to you or be untruthful, they just don't want to disappoint you. So if you tell them not to take it, and then you're dismissive and you just say, okay, great, you're not going to take that, then they're going to stop sharing that information with you. And we need that information so we can understand what they're taking, what diets they're following, because those are the kinds of things that can interact with treatments. And we need to understand if the patient has something that happens during treatment, we want to look at all of the factors that might contribute to whether they had a good outcome or a bad outcome. So I think it's important to document that.